In the final months of 1918, Germany was not only facing the end of a devastating war, but also the complete disintegration of its political, social, and economic structure. On the Western Front, German soldiers, exhausted after years of fighting, could barely stand. At the same time, cities suffered a general paralysis. Food shortages, extreme rationing, runaway inflation, and logistical collapse had turned daily life into a permanent struggle for survival. The civilian population, after years of sacrifice, was no longer willing to sustain a war effort perceived as futile. The German Empire, which at the beginning of the conflict had promised greatness and territorial expansion, found itself without effective leadership, with its economy collapsing and its army on the verge of insubordination. Workshops linked to the war effort began to experience increasing conflict. As resources dwindled and wages fell behind, widespread demands for food and minimal working conditions arose. In the ports, sailors refused to follow orders considered suicidal, as happened in Kiel, where a mutiny sparked a chain of rebellions that spread to other cities in a matter of days. This uprising marked a turning point. Workers and soldiers began to organize themselves into revolutionary councils that replicated the Soviet model, taking local control without waiting for instructions from Berlin. Traditional structures were crumbling under popular pressure. In the streets, thousands demanded the end of the monarchy, an immediate ceasefire, and a total reorganization of the state. The imperial system, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, collapsed without effective resistance, and his departure precipitated the fall of the old order, with no clear replacement plan in place. On November 11th, the signing of the armistice at Compiègne brought an end to the military confrontations. But far from bringing relief, it left a widespread sense of disorientation and betrayal. For much of German society, the surrender had come abruptly and incomprehensibly. No foreign troops were occupying German cities, no territory had been visibly lost, and yet defeat was accepted. This perception fueled a narrative of internal deception, which began to gain traction in military circles, among conservative sectors, and in nationalist publications. There was increasing talk of a stab in the back, an idea that would have lasting political effects. The birth of the Weimar Republic occurred in this chaotic context. It was not the result of a planned transition, but rather a forced fall with no visible alternative. The new government had to operate in a society in ruins, without solid legitimacy and with a deeply divided citizenry. The old elites continued to occupy key positions in the administration, while labor movements demanded structural reforms. The Republic was not received with enthusiasm, but rather with suspicion. Most considered it an improvisation imposed by defeat rather than a collective project. At the same time, former combatants returned to an unrecognizable homeland, without state support, without opportunities, and with visible and invisible traumas that only worsened their reintegration. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 exacerbated all tensions. The agreed terms were seen as a humiliating imposition. Germany was forced to assume full blame for the conflict, surrender key regions like Alsace and Lorraine, reduce its army to a symbolic fraction, and pay impossible reparations. These measures directly affected the economic structure, prevented proper industrial recovery, and fueled distrust of the leaders of the new republic. In every corner of the country there was a sense of unjust punishment and helplessness in the face of foreign powers, imposing their will without the possibility of rebuttal. The national economy began to collapse shortly after. Unemployment rose rapidly, factories closed due to a lack of raw materials, and small businesses were unable to survive. The currency almost completely lost its value, and in ordinary households, buying bread or coal became a daily challenge. Newspapers reported on the economic disaster, and lines grew in front of soup kitchens in the streets. Mothers exchanged personal belongings for food, and children grew up in an environment marked by extreme poverty. In this tense atmosphere, ideological extremes gained strength. On the one hand, leftist groups, inspired by the Russian Revolution, demanded nationalization, workers' control, and a radical transformation of the state. On the other, ultranationalist sectors denounced the weakness of the republican system and promoted an authoritarian restoration based on military pride and Germanic tradition. Cities became symbolic and literal battlefields. Political assassinations, armed revolts, and clashes between street militias were part of daily life. Instability was not an isolated incident. but a permanent feature of those years. The general malaise intensified every day. The population was not only impoverished, but also emotionally exhausted and politically disconnected. Distrust of the government grew in all sectors. Attempts to restore order were seen as insufficient or belated. The police forces and the army, weakened and demoralized, could not guarantee stability. Institutions offered no clear answers, and in this confusion, many people began to look for more radical alternatives. The pent-up rage, the sense of betrayal, and the desire for revenge became a breeding ground for rhetoric promising reconstruction, identity, and firm leadership. Although still faceless, a narrative that appealed to wounded national pride and the need to regain lost control was beginning to emerge. The ground was prepared not by the work of a specific leader, but by a chain of failures, frustrations, and decisions imposed from outside. Germany, defeated and divided, was entering a new, uncertain, and dangerous era marked by wounds that had yet to heal. From humiliation to fanaticism, the genesis of ideological hatred. From a very young age, Adolf Hitler showed signs of detachment, constant frustration, and a permanent clash with his immediate surroundings. He was born in Braunau am Inn, a small town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire located near the German border, and grew up under the shadow of a strict father with whom he never managed to establish a stable relationship. His childhood was a succession of family disagreements, and in his adolescence he found refuge in painting, architecture, and readings that exalted Germanic culture. For years he tried to enter the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but was rejected. More than once, which plunged him into increasing isolation and a feeling of being excluded from the world he aspired to. During his time in Vienna, he lived between cheap boarding houses and shelters for the needy. He lacked a stable income and spent his days amidst failed drawings, obsessive reading, and a growing mental rigidity. The city was diverse, multicultural, and dynamic, which clashed with his fixed ideas about nation, race, and belonging. In this context, he came into increasing contact with anti-Semitic discourses disseminated in pamphlets, articles, and ideological circles. This narrative adopted a simplified view that blamed certain groups for the country's overall situation, reinforcing his sense of exclusion. He adopted this unqualified view, assimilating the extreme simplifications offered by these environments as certainties. When World War I broke out, he moved to Munich and voluntarily enlisted in the Bavarian army. There he found for the first time a clear routine, a sense of belonging, and a defined identity. He was assigned as a messenger on the Western Front, where he was exposed to intense combat, bombing, mud, hunger, and death. Although he never achieved a high rank, he experienced the brutality of the conflict firsthand. He was wounded twice and received decorations, but what marked him most was the difference between the camaraderie at the front and the news coming from the rear. He was outraged by strikes, pacifist pamphlets, and criticism of the government. He believed that while soldiers were risking their lives, others were sabotaging the common effort from within. In 1918, during a gas attack, he was temporarily blinded and admitted to a military hospital in Pacewalk. There, he learned of the end of the war and the collapse of the front. The news paralyzed him, unable to assimilate what was happening. When he regained his sight, he returned to a Munich plunged into chaos, with clashes between revolutionary groups and weakened state structures. Without a job or a clear direction, he was housed in a barracks and assigned to minor tasks by the army, which was trying to prevent veterans from joining the revolts. It was in this disoriented environment that he began attending political meetings. At first, he observed without intervening, but soon began to speak with a direct style, simple phrases, and messages filled with rage. Although he still lacked a defined platform or specific political objectives, he already stood out for his ability to capture the anger of his listeners. Accumulated frustrations, post-war resentment, and his hardened view of the conflict fused into a discourse that appealed to the need for order, authority, and belonging. At the same time, he deepened his exposure to radical publications. He read newspapers like the Münchener Beobachter and nationalist pamphlets that repeated the ideas he had already internalized. That the defeat had not been military but internal, that the nation was in danger, and that certain groups acted as infiltrating enemies. During those years, his thinking became more rigid. For him, left-wing parties did not represent social demands, but rather the local manifestation of an international conspiracy. He did not distinguish between socialists, communists, or liberals. All were seen as agents of decadence. He adopted a racial reading of history, influenced by authors who promoted the existence of biological hierarchies among peoples. On that scale, the Germanic peoples should occupy the highest level. He believed that racial mixing weakened nations and that ethnic purity guaranteed stability and a future. This idea, disseminated for years by racist publications, found a permanent place in his thinking. It was no longer enough to restrict the role of certain social or cultural sectors. His vision demanded absolute homogeneity without compromise, where there would be no room for distinct identities within the national project he envisioned. Founding and rise of the National Socialist movement. When the war ended, Germany was not only economically and militarily ruined, but also politically lost. In this confusing environment, numerous small groups emerged, made up of veterans, nationalists, and those dissatisfied with the defeat, which began to multiply in different cities. Munich, in particular, became a center for meetings, fiery pamphlets, and spontaneous speeches. It was in this context that a nearly irrelevant group emerged, the German Workers' Party, a group with no clear ambitions or visible structure, which would soon undergo a complete transformation. This party was founded by Anton Drexler, a locksmith with ideas opposed to communism, bourgeois liberalism, and a strong nationalist bent. At first they met in neighborhood beer halls with barely a dozen people. They had no defined political program or strategic direction. They functioned more as a space for venting than a real organization. Even so, some began to look for members who would contribute more than frustration. At one of these meetings in late 1919, a young ex-soldier with a gifted speaking talent attended. That day, Adolf Hitler appeared. The first time he spoke, his exalted style and aggressive discourse left their mark. He had no political training, but he knew when to raise his voice and how to connect with the audience's anger. Drexler quickly realized that this young man could serve as a vehicle for further expansion and proposed that he formally join. Although everything was still rudimentary, Hitler began to shape his ideas there and, above all, to project them to others. As the months passed, the party began to gain some visibility. New contributors arrived, better presented pamphlets were printed, and the meetings began to attract more attendees. An important step was changing the name. They became known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This wasn't just a marketing ploy. They sought to attract nationalist sectors as well as disaffected workers. Although they didn't have a specific economic proposal, the name allowed them to broaden their reach. Hitler, who began as a simple orator, increasingly took on more influence in decisions. His relationship with Drexler deteriorated when their visions for the party's future clashed. Drexler wanted to maintain a certain degree of restraint, while Hitler opted for a more direct and visible strategy. The rupture was inevitable, and Drexler eventually left. With that, Hitler gained leverage. With the new name and some founding members gone, the party began to take on a different form. Despite their material limitations, they launched their first public campaigns with precarious resources, homemade posters, improvised flags, and speeches that combined nationalism, promises of order, and attacks on internal enemies. The meetings went from empty tables to attracting dozens of people seeking quick answers to the economic chaos. At this stage, the group still didn't have an organized structure. They had no electoral plan or administrative mechanisms. They functioned as a movement of agitation. But this flexibility also allowed them to rehearse messages, test symbols, and build an image that broke with the norm. They used direct language, striking colors, and defined themselves as the only ones who spoke out when others remained silent. One innovation they began to implement was the staging of their events. Although they didn't follow a fixed style, they began to organize how attendees were positioned, where the speaker stood, and what visual elements accompanied them. Everything was intuitive, but they were already seeking to generate an emotional impact. They didn't want to simply convince with ideas, but to provoke a collective reaction. At the same time, Hitler's stature grew. From participating in speeches, he moved on to intervening in decisions, negotiating alliances, and shaping the group's public image. His presence became a magnet. Many came more for him than for the content of the events. This centrality arose not from a formal position, but from the public's response and his own insistence on leading. Between 1920 and 1921, they organized more ambitious events. They rented venues, distributed leaflets in other areas of Munich, and created their own publications. Although they lacked national reach, they were establishing themselves as a visible player in the city. The message continued to revolve around post-war resentment, the demand for authority, and the need to point the finger of blame without nuance. Over time, people with diverse profiles joined. Some had technical knowledge, others offered contacts, and a few helped organize a more coherent discourse. They were not yet a solid organization, but rather a growing group seeking its place in local politics. Every action, no matter how small, gave them notoriety. When they drafted their first program, they did so in general terms, avoiding details. The goal was not to present a detailed plan, but to launch slogans that appealed to discontent. The text included criticism of the peace treaty, territorial claims, vague social demands, and an aggressive tone. It was more a manifesto for impact than a serious project. By 1922, the party already had a recognizable identity, a steady base of followers, and an informal focal point that commanded attention. Although its reach was still limited and its structure incomplete, it was no longer a rarity. The movement was consolidating itself as a vocal and increasingly visible presence on the local scene. Munich shooting, trial across Germany. The closest reference for some National Socialist Party leaders was the recent coup attempt led by Benito Mussolini in Italy. The so-called March on Rome had brought a marginal movement to power in just a few days, and the idea of replicating that model began to circulate in the most active circles of the party. Adolf Hitler and his collaborators believed that decisive action from Bavaria, where the conservative regional government was experiencing tensions with Berlin, could be the first step toward national change. If they gained military support and sufficient visibility, they believed a local uprising could trigger a chain reaction. For weeks, secret talks between party leaders and certain sectors of the Bavarian army took place. Attempts were made to recruit influential figures, and plans were drawn up to seize key buildings, neutralize opponents, and proclaim a new government from Munich. However, many of these meetings were improvised and based more on enthusiasm than concrete strategy. Internal differences among the conspirators and a lack of real coordination made the plan unstable from the start. On November 8, 1923, it was decided to act. That day, a large political meeting was being held in a Munich beer hall, the Bürgerbräukeller, where high-ranking Bavarian government officials were present. Hitler and a group of armed men stormed the premises, interrupted the event, and declared that the local government had been dismissed. Armed with weapons in hand, they attempted to force the leaders present to join their cause. Although they initially achieved a favorable moment of confusion, it soon became clear that they did not have the military support they had hoped for. During the early morning and the following hours, the coup plotters attempted to consolidate control of the city. Marches were organized, attempts were made to seize official buildings, and messages proclaiming the beginning of a new order were distributed. But the authorities' reaction was swift. The Bavarian police and army mobilized loyal troops and began to regain positions. On the morning of November 9th, direct confrontations erupted between the rebels and the security forces. The most significant confrontation occurred when a group of party activists, led by Hitler and other leaders, marched through the city center hoping to drum up support. Upon reaching an intersection near the Ministry of Defense, police forces opened fire. Within minutes, the march dispersed. Several people were killed instantly and others were wounded. Hitler briefly escaped, but was arrested 2 days later in a nearby town. The coup had failed miserably. Far from bringing about political change, what remained was an image of improvisation and violence without results. The Bavarian authorities immediately initiated legal proceedings. Hitler and the main organizers were charged with high treason, a serious charge that could carry several years in prison. The trial, however, became an unexpected opportunity for the main defendant. From the first day of hearings, Hitler used the trial as a platform. Instead of appearing defensive, he adopted a defiant attitude. He took full responsibility for the coup attempt, not as an illegal act, but as a patriotic action against a system he considered illegitimate. His speeches were lengthy, theatrical, and laden with accusations against the Weimar government, the communists, and perceived internal enemies. The judges, many of them sympathetic to nationalist positions, allowed him to run riot. The trial, which under other circumstances would have been a simple sentencing, was transformed into a political platform. The press covered every day, and Hitler's speeches were reproduced in newspapers and pamphlets. His image transformed from that of a marginal agitator into that of someone willing to sacrifice himself for his ideas, even if they landed him in prison. The sentence was surprisingly lenient. Although he was found guilty, he received a 5-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Landsberg prison, a low-security prison where political prisoners enjoyed certain privileges. He had a spacious cell, access to frequent visitors, open correspondence, and free time to write and receive collaborators. During his time in prison, Hitler maintained contact with the core of the party. Although the organization was weakened by the failed coup, some followers continued to operate from outside. Publications were reorganized, the network of contacts was maintained, and a new path for the future began to be planned. Internal discussions no longer revolved around impulsive actions, but rather more lasting forms of political integration. Imprisonment was not experienced as a defeat. On the contrary, within his inner circle, a narrative was constructed where the failure of the coup became a test of commitment. Hitler was presented as someone who had risked his freedom for a just cause. This image was reinforced with photographs, articles, and testimonies, creating the image of a leader willing to do anything. The atmosphere in Landsberg, far from being hostile, favored this construction. The jailers sympathized with some aspects of the nationalist ideology and allowed for differentiated treatment. The partial isolation also allowed Hitler to reflect on past mistakes and begin to define a more structured strategy. In this process, his collaborators played a key role in collecting documents, organizing visits, and planning the next steps. Hitler's time in prison lasted less than the established deadline. In December 1924, after serving just over a year, Hitler was released. Political conditions had changed slightly, and the authorities deemed him no longer an immediate threat. Upon his release, he found a weakened party, but one with a base waiting for him. Prison had not extinguished his prominence, but rather consolidated him as a symbol. From that moment on, the party's strategy would shift. The experience of the coup and prison served as a turning point. The path would no longer be one of direct violence, but rather the construction of a project with a semblance of legality. Without abandoning their ideas, they began to adapt to the rules of the institutional game. What they learned in those months set the tone for what would come later, when the National Socialist Party would move from the margins to the center of German political life. Mein Kampf, Manual of Hate and Obedience. Mein Kampf was structured as a personal manifesto with no room for nuance or dissent. From the first pages, Hitler drew a division between those he believed to be true Germans and those who represented a danger to the nation. He placed Jews at the center of that threat, not as a religious or cultural community, but as a noxious element infiltrating different areas of German life. This idea was insistently repeated throughout the volume alongside criticisms of the parliamentary system, denunciations of an alleged moral decline, and calls for the restoration of a single, centralized command. In the first chapters, the author recalled his time in the war as a process that, according to him, strengthened his identification with the nation. From that experience, he developed a vision in which certain social and political sectors were presented as persistent threats to the collective order. In his account, it became essential to establish a sharp separation between those he considered compatible with his national project and those he considered compatible with the nation, who, in his view, were hindering its realization. This division justified his call for a total reconfiguration of society. Parliamentarism was also the subject of outright rejection. He described it as an ineffective system, plagued by particular interests and far removed from the common good. Parties were portrayed as hollow structures devoid of convictions, where sterile negotiation reigned. In its place, he proposed a model of one-person leadership, where a leader assumed the entire national will and decided without delay or interference. The conception of the state revolved around the complete subordination of the individual. In this logic, the citizen's objective was not to develop freely, but rather to play a role within a group. The collective interest was placed above any personal aspirations. There was no room for dissent, and authority must act without hesitation. Marxism was another central target. He described it not as a theory with foundations, but as a tool of destruction promoted by hidden forces. He repeatedly stated that his intention was to disintegrate the German essence and linked it to the adversaries that appeared throughout the work. Instead of concrete data, he offered a series of reiterative associations between communism, decadence, and international conspiracies. He also offered a personal reading of German history, where events were interpreted as part of a constant struggle for national survival. Defeats were explained not by their own mistakes, but by the actions of internal enemies. This version of the past justified the need for internal cleansing. Violence was not rejected, but rather validated as a legitimate means. Hitler advocated the removal of obstacles through force. This removal could be directed against people, ideas, or institutions, always under the premise of a threat that supposedly justified everything. Absolute obedience and a willingness to use extreme methods were presented as virtues. The role of the leader was described as indispensable. He wasn't presented as a peer among others, but as a leading figure with a clear vision and determination to act. He represented the country's direction, and his adherence to it was unquestionable. Dissent was not seen as a valid option. In another section, the book delved into the idea of an invisible and omnipresent enemy, represented primarily by the Jew. This was not a specific threat, but a diffuse influence that insinuated itself everywhere. This approach served to justify constant surveillance and preventive measures against any individual. An atmosphere of constant suspicion was fostered as a form of national defense. A significant portion of the book addressed politics from a biological perspective. Hitler manipulated Darwinian concepts to argue that only strong societies deserved to survive. Those considered weak should disappear, and the suffering of others was not seen as an ethical problem, but as a natural consequence. Showing compassion was considered a weakness, while constant struggle was promoted as the norm. The content consistently relied on simple and direct language, leaving no room for interpretation. Rather than inviting analysis, he sought to establish his ideas through reiteration, aiming to impress them on the reader without the need for arguments. Formally, the style was disordered and irregularly structured. However, the language was accessible and direct. It aimed at a broad audience that sought certainty, not complexity. This choice responded to the intention of attracting social sectors disoriented or marginalized by the crisis. Various parts of the text outlined the expected functioning of institutions according to this vision. Education was to focus on developing resilient physiques and submissive thoughts. Artistic expressions were only accepted if they contributed to the aims of the state. The media, for their part, were to be regulated to prevent the circulation of opposing opinions. Every component of society was to be coordinated with a unified purpose of ideological conformity. Finally, the Nazi leader maintained that any structural transformation must begin with a single principle: the elimination of racial mixing. This idea was not just another proposal, but the foundation for everything else. If biological purity was not guaranteed, no other action would be effective. From this point, the rest of the program acquired internal coherence. Thus, the book was presented as a closed plan for social organization and political domination. Each section, from the education of youth to the use of force, was integrated into an ideological logic with no room for doubt. This was not a debatable proposal, but a set of statements demanding total submission. Strict hierarchy, blind obedience, and systematic exclusion were the pillars of this totalitarian construct. From marginal party to national wave. Beginning in the late 1920s, the German economy suffered a severe setback that fundamentally altered the political landscape. The financial collapse in the United States quickly impacted the rest of the world's markets, and Germany, heavily tied to American loans, was among the hardest hit. With this capital flow cut off, many German companies were forced to close their doors or reduce staff, resulting in a massive increase in unemployment. Hundreds of thousands lost their livelihoods, and anxiety spread across all sectors. In urban areas, lines for food became common, while in agricultural areas, impossible to pay debts piled up. In this climate of insecurity, the political system began to crumble. The Weimar Republic, already weakened by years of instability, proved lacking the necessary tools to provide a swift and effective response. Governments succeeded one another without continuity. Coalitions were fragile, and agreements became increasingly difficult to maintain. As desperation grew, so did disenchantment with traditional parties, both left and right. The population sought drastic solutions, and the hardest-hit sectors began to shift their support toward proposals that had until then been viewed as marginal. In this new context, the National Socialist German Workers' Party began to gain a greater presence. Although it had garnered some attention in the past, its influence remained limited. However, changing conditions propelled its advance. Its message, which united rejection of the post-war agreements, opposition to traditional political forces, and a strong emphasis on national identity, managed to connect with diverse audiences, from bankrupt merchants to dispossessed former military personnel. Occupation, many individuals began to consider this group as an option in the face of the prevailing uncertainty. During the first elections after the start of the crisis, the party's results showed considerable progress. Although they did not achieve a majority, their parliamentary presence grew rapidly, allowing them to gain influence in political discussions. What was most striking was the speed with which they gained support, even in regions where they had not previously had a presence. This rise was not limited to a specific area, but spread to different parts of the country, making it clear that this was not an isolated or temporary phenomenon. One of the reasons for this growth was its ability to present itself as a distinct movement outside of traditional structures. While the traditional parties were perceived as part of the problem, National Socialism presented itself as a refreshing option, with a proposal that promised order, unity, and immediate solutions. Furthermore, its leaders knew how to take advantage of the prevailing unrest. They organized mass events, visited small towns, spoke directly to those affected, and tailored their message to the audience. This closeness allowed them to establish ties with communities that had previously felt ignored. Institutional erosion and the prolonged crisis continued to affect all levels of daily life. The number of unemployed surpassed previous records, and the rising cost of basic goods particularly impacted the most vulnerable sectors. In this context, the party's image continued to strengthen. With each election, its votes increased and its support base broadened. What was initially seen as an extreme grouping came to be seen by many as the only possible solution. The change was not only quantitative but also qualitative. In addition to gaining voters, the movement attracted people with experience in different fields, which improved its internal organization and management capacity. Between 1931 and 1932, the movement's progress was particularly notable. In certain areas, its results came close to total vote control. This development generated concern among other political groups, which attempted to coordinate through pacts or joint campaigns, but without achieving significant results. The divided party landscape impeded any kind of joint action. At the same time, the National Socialists were able to occupy the spaces left by their rivals, strengthening their position as a decisive force. They were no longer simply an additional presence in Parliament, but a force that was beginning to shape the national direction. The increase in membership could also be seen in the number of people joining. Every month, thousands decided to join what they saw as an opportunity to regain a measure of collective dignity. In different localities, new branches were opened, youth groups emerged, and complementary entities were organized that provided assistance, recreational opportunities, and a shared identity. This expansion was not limited to elections. They forged ties, gained a presence in multiple spaces, and maintained ongoing visibility. Their influence reached everyday environments such as streets, workplaces, educational institutions, and neighborhood groups. Support did not come only from vulnerable sectors. Middle classes and some business people also began to welcome their advance. For many industrialists, the promise of order and discipline seemed attractive in the face of the fear of an advance of communism. This convergence of diverse interests helped sustain the party's rise in multiple areas. Fronts. While some supported it out of conviction, others did so out of convenience, but all agreed on the urgency of profound change. This shared perception allowed resistance to be reduced and the movement's discourse to gain ground without the need to impose itself by force. During this period, the party's leaders actively participated in public debates, occupied seats in parliament, and established ties with influential figures. Each intervention was used to reinforce its image as a solid alternative. Although their proposals were not always detailed, they managed to connect with the emotions of the moment. In the face of uncertainty, they offered security. In the face of disorder, they promised direction. This combination was key to expanding their support base in such a short time. By the end of 1932, the group had reached first place in terms of electoral support. Its growth was evident. What years before had been merely an organization with limited representation was now positioned at the heart of the country's political life. This transformation was not only due to its messages, but also to the broader situation. The lack of concrete solutions, the discrediting of the authorities, and the atmosphere of crisis led many to turn to different alternatives. In this context of uncertainty, National Socialism managed to forge a path without encountering major obstacles. As they gained a presence at the polls, their margin of political influence also expanded. Although they were not part of the executive branch, the number of seats they obtained gave them the ability to intervene in important decisions. This position gave them an advantageous position, as they could condition agreements without having to answer for the results. From that base, they made progress in strengthening strategic ties, established relationships with key figures, and remained attentive to developments. Everything seemed to indicate that a major change was approaching, although there were still variables to be defined. Everyday anti-Semitism, when hate became a habit. Long before National Socialism took control of the state, a hostile attitude toward Jews existed in broad sectors of German society, one that went beyond the old religious disputes. This type of rejection was not exclusive to small circles, nor did it emerge recently. It had taken root in diverse spheres, from everyday life to the school environment. The perception of Jews as a group outside the national larger group, even though many had been established citizens for generations, spread without much resistance. In the educational setting, in informal conversations and in accessible reading materials, expressions and descriptions were repeated that portrayed them as different, problematic, or untrustworthy. This type of rejection wasn't usually expressed with open aggression, but it was constant. It often took the form of jokes, ambiguous comments, or barely perceptible exclusion mechanisms. In the workplace, it was common for a Jew's suitability for important positions to be questioned, even when they met all the criteria. Local media outlets proliferated with articles alluding to harmful influences without explicitly naming anyone. In theater or best-selling books, the character with Jewish features often represented self-serving or disloyal attitudes. This repeated image eventually became embedded in people's general perceptions without requiring a specific directive. At the beginning of the 20th century, publications and pamphlets questioning the presence of Jews in public affairs were already circulating. These texts were freely available and read by different sectors of the population. Some argued that Jews accumulated excessive financial power, while others blamed them for promoting strange currents, such as pacifism or internationalist thought. Although these accusations contradicted each other, they all agreed in portraying them as alien to the common good. This narrative gained strength especially during times of economic crisis or political instability, when simple explanations were more appealing than in-depth interpretations. In educational settings, many teachers freely shared these ideas. There was no strict regulation on content, so some teachers introduced their own opinions into classes. In subjects such as history or literature, it was common for negative aspects to be highlighted when discussing Jewish figures. Even in technical subjects, comments were sometimes made that reinforced stereotypes. This created an environment where children grew up hearing negative statements that became part of their everyday life. In religious life, discourses of exclusion also persisted. Although many Protestant churches had left behind the old theological accusations, some maintained the idea that Jews resisted recognizing the truth and therefore remained a closed community. This discourse did not openly call for discrimination, but it reinforced the perception that Jews could never fully be part of the national whole. The insistence on their differences reinforced a symbolic barrier that prevented full integration. In the entertainment world, stereotypes were also common. In many silent films, the character portrayed as Jewish had exaggerated features and caricature-like behavior. The use of certain names, accents, or styles of dress helped audiences quickly identify that character as someone who could not be trusted. These elements passed off as humor or custom, but they left a lasting mark on the way viewers perceived the Jewish community. This negative portrayal didn't require direct discourse, it worked through repetition. During the post-war period, the discontent over the defeat and the conditions imposed by the victors created a climate of widespread frustration. In this context, many sought to blame those within the country itself. the idea that certain groups had acted against the national interest became popular, and among them, Jews were frequently singled out. Although there was no evidence to support these claims, resentment gradually took hold. A simplified explanation for the military collapse began to circulate, focusing on accusations against internal actors who had supposedly weakened the country from within. This view spread through family conversations, private letters, and low-cost publications. This attitude also manifested itself in unofficial marginalization from various settings. In sports clubs, artistic organizations, or community gatherings, Jews were frequently prevented from integrating without any explicit rules. Sometimes it was enough to create an uncomfortable atmosphere or simply to exclude certain people. This form of distancing was not always deliberate, but it was effective in highlighting differences. In several cases, the affected individuals themselves decided to distance themselves, to avoid tensions, which further fueled the impression that they did not belong to the rest. This attitude was also reflected in the literature of the period. Some popular authors wrote stories where Jewish characters represented greed or corruption. While others attempted to present a more balanced image, these books often lacked the same reach. Works that conformed to existing prejudices sold better and circulated more easily. This market selection also helped reinforce certain ideas. The available content influenced the way people viewed the world without the need to impose an official line. An analysis of personal diaries and private correspondence from that time reveals that many people already held a negative image of Jews, even before any formal indoctrination. This opinion didn't always stem from direct experience, but rather from what was heard in their surroundings. The repetition of certain phrases, the circulation of gossip, and the social validation of contempt created a context in which it was easy to accept these prejudices as fact. This predisposition facilitated the acceptance of extreme proposals in many sectors. Contempt was not limited to certain social groups. Although it was more common in some classes or regions, it extended across the board. From merchants to workers, from students to retirees, attitudes of distrust were present at different levels. This generalization did not imply that everyone shared the same degree of hostility, but it did imply that there was a common basis on which more aggressive discourses could be built. The ground was already prepared before organized structures emerged to systematically exploit it. In official documents prior to 1933, examples of discrimination can also be found. Some public offices avoided hiring Jewish people, claiming that it could generate tensions. Others applied different criteria when evaluating candidates based on their origins. Although these practices were not regulated by law, they were known and accepted by many. This institutional exclusion, although partial, contributed to legitimizing rejection and presenting it as normal. The absence of strong reactions to these events shows the extent to which contempt had become a shared custom. Meanwhile, in public discourse, influential figures could express openly discriminatory ideas without receiving social condemnation. Some writers, professors, or community leaders shared texts that spoke of cultural purity or national tradition as if they were neutral concepts, but in practice excluded those who did not fit certain parameters. This way of speaking consolidated a language that allowed discrimination without insults. By repeating these concepts in different spaces, a vision of the country was constructed in which certain people simply had no place. The rejection did not come from a single source, nor did it respond to a centralized initiative. It was formed from multiple minor gestures, habitual expressions, implicit decisions, and repeated omissions that, when combined, shaped an environment marked by contempt. This attitude did not require visible organization. It was kept alive by its constant reiteration, complicit silence, and lack of questioning. Therefore, when ideas emerged that turned that contempt into concrete proposals, they found a base already shaped by years of normalized social rejection. Choreography of fear: how the party hypnotized the German people. From its earliest stages as a growing movement, National Socialism adopted a form of expression that transcended the use of words. The party's structure began to emphasize the importance of visual elements, distinctive tones, emblems, and modes of public display. Every appearance, every meeting, and every presentation had to convey an impression of discipline, group cohesion, and unquestionable strength. Aesthetics assumed a key role. Organized tours, coordinated formations, and the use of insignia were not limited to mere adornment, but were deliberately selected resources to impact and consolidate a sense of shared belonging. At these mass meetings, the organization of the environment played a fundamental role. The seating arrangement of attendees, the position of the main platform, the lighting effects, and the sounds used were all carefully planned to provoke an emotional response. The insignia did not serve any aesthetic function, but rather acted as symbolic elements that created a homogeneous sensation. The use of artificial lighting, especially at events held at night, generated atmospheres reminiscent of ancient ceremonies. Everything was coordinated to transform a political event into a group experience charged with solemnity. Attention was also paid to body language, body positions, greeting gestures, and movements followed a precise structure. The gesture of the raised arm became institutionalized in all contexts, from educational settings to official events, as an expression of submission and alignment with the movement. Uniform clothing was integrated into this staging. Each element of the outfit had a purpose, and the appearance of identically dressed groups reinforced the image of a rigorous collective order. It wasn't just a matter of shared attire, but of visually projecting a sense of structured discipline. As public events multiplied, certain rituals also became established. The opening of events followed fixed sequences. Specific music was played, flags were raised, established phrases were uttered. Each step had its time, place, and function. This was not accidental. This repetition sought to imprint in the participants' memories a series of gestures that required no rational explanation. Words were combined with gestures and gestures with objects, creating a choreography that reinforced the sense of belonging. Memorial ceremonies, especially those dedicated to the fallen, held a special place. At these events, the stage setting was charged with a solemn tone. Torches were lit, long silences were observed, names were recited. This theatricality was not improvised. It was designed to provoke emotion, consolidate a heroic narrative, and establish a connection between the past and the present. The use of silence as a dramatic element became common. Saying nothing also communicated. Party congresses became a kind of national dramatization. The cities that hosted them were decorated with banners, placards, and temporary structures that transformed the urban landscape. Participants were guided in processions, marches, and assemblies, all carefully choreographed. The press and newscasts recorded every gesture, every word, and every set. Every detail was carefully considered: the position of the lights, the angle of the cameras, the music playing in the background. Everything contributed to creating an impression of grandeur. The party's youth were also trained in this theatricality. From a very early age, participants learned to march, sing in groups, form human figures, and execute coordinated movements. This training not only conveyed ideas but also shaped behavior. Outdoor activities, celebrations of important dates, and camps were full of theatrical elements. A parallel world was created where collective action replaced individual action. Architects and engineers actively participated in this process. Monumental settings were designed to generate impact. Open spaces were preferred for hosting large gatherings. Imposing tribunes were erected, columns were installed, and geometrically shaped platforms were used. Everything contributed to reinforcing the idea of power. Architecture wasn't just functional, it served to tell a story. Every building, every square, every avenue had to convey a clear visual message. The use of sound was precisely planned. Musical pieces were selected that evoked specific feelings. Some melodies became identified with specific moments within the events. The official songs were memorized by everyone and sung in different contexts. This integration of music, movement, and visual elements generated a sense of complete unity. The audience did not adopt a passive attitude. By singing hymns, following the rhythm, or performing synchronized gestures, they actively participated in the performance. Lighting was used as a central element in many events. The columns of light projected into the sky at certain nighttime events created a sense of elevation. These vertical beams, repeated synchronously, enveloped the audience in a distinct atmosphere, removed from the everyday. The partial darkness, combined with illuminated points, directed the gaze towards specific areas. This achieved a manipulation of space that transformed each event into a staged performance. Images played a prominent role. Institutional snapshots, posters, and visual representations not only depicted figures but also created a symbolic repertoire. The choice of perspectives, framing, and gestures was intentional. The goal was to communicate firmness, vitality, and dominance. These faces were displayed in educational centers, administrative offices, and domestic spaces, generating a perception of constant surveillance. The visual repetition of the same countenance eventually became part of the everyday environment. The dates marked on the official calendar were established with a consistency reminiscent of unchanging rituals. Year after year, certain specific days took on a prominent role within the commemorative framework. The established routine, the repetition of events, and the massive turnout served to consolidate a sense of permanence. Rather than recalling past events, these days sought to reinforce shared commitment. Although each celebration might differ in specific aspects, it maintained a fixed structure that combined the new with the familiar, ensuring an effective emotional response from those who participated. The urban space was also intervened in a planned manner. Streets were renamed, monuments were erected, and squares were redesigned to reflect the movement's values. The march routes were carefully selected to pass through symbolic areas. The route became a visual narrative, with each corner providing a message. The city itself became a permanent stage set. The staging wasn't restricted to events with large audiences. It also extended to small gatherings, neighborhood activities, and receptions for officials. In each of these settings, a precise visual scheme was organized. The seating arrangement, the exact timing of the applause, and the elements to be exchanged were established. Everything was meticulously planned. This attention to specifics created an impression of absolute control. This stage structure was used as a resource to communicate authority. What mattered wasn't only what was expressed in words, but also how it was presented to the audience. Every movement, every symbol, and every sound were integrated into a narrative that projected discipline, cohesion, and continuity as if inherent. The performance didn't function as decoration, but as content itself. Form and message merged in a single sense, to persuade through shared stimuli. The construction of totalitarian power, the hour of destruction. When Adolf Hitler took office as Chancellor in January 1933, his party still did not control the entire state apparatus. The cabinet was composed mostly of conservative figures, and President Hindenburg retained formal authority over key decisions. However, within weeks, changes began to be implemented that left the previous structures behind. The Reichstag fire in February was attributed to an alleged communist conspiracy, and this version allowed the government to implement immediate restrictions. Rights such as freedom of expression and assembly, as well as privacy of communications, were suspended. The police were given new powers to act without judicial oversight, including arrests and the closure of critical media outlets. What was initially presented as an emergency response became a permanent tool to eliminate any opposition. In March, new elections were held amid a climate of intimidation and attacks against political opponents. Although the Nazi Party increased its vote count, it still fell short of an absolute majority. Even so, the result served as the basis for pushing through a law that completely changed the way the system worked, the Enabling Act. With its passage, the government could enact legally binding regulations without going through Parliament. The vote took place while many opposition deputies were absent due to threats or arrests, which facilitated its passage. With this legal framework consolidated, steps began to dismantle political pluralism. The other parties were dissolved, the unions were suppressed, and their assets were confiscated. A united labor front was established under state control, and the federal states lost their autonomy, replaced by authorities appointed from Berlin. A purge also took place within the party. In 1934, during a coordinated operation, the leaders of the SA were arrested and executed. The measure sought to dispel internal tensions and reassure conservative sectors of the army. That same year, after Hindenburg's death, no elections were called. Instead, the merger of the positions of head of state and head of government was announced. Hitler remained in command of the country and the armed forces, and a referendum was organized to ratify this change, albeit with obvious irregularities. From then on, all officials, including judges and military personnel, had to swear direct allegiance to the Fuhrer. With all power centralized, decisions no longer passed through shared bodies. Departments were established to oversee education, media, film, and other cultural aspects. Directives came directly from the top, and the lower echelons simply followed them without room for discussion. Any disagreement could be seen as disloyalty to the regime. Externally, the new direction began to be felt in 1935 with the announcement of rearmament. This decision violated the Treaty of Versailles but was greeted with public celebrations. The following year, German troops entered the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone since the end of World War I. The European powers did not respond, reinforcing the perception that they could advance without consequences. In 1938, Austria was annexed. The event was presented as a national reunification, with parades, flags, and speeches. Shortly after, territories of Czechoslovakia that included German-speaking populations were incorporated. It was argued that this was a measure to protect that community, and images of jubilation were broadcast on all official channels. In September 1939, German forces invaded Poland after signing a pact with the Soviet Union that established the division of the country. The German regime presented manipulated incidents to justify the offensive, although the intention to occupy the territory was already clear. The reaction of France and the United Kingdom was immediate. Both nations declared war, initiating a large-scale conflict that had been prepared for years. At that point, all the power accumulated since 1933 was revealed in its final form. The laws, the administration, the army, and the media all responded to a single name. The legal transformation of the early years had become a military and political apparatus that operated without institutional restraints and whose reach would soon extend to all of Europe. This entire process, driven from the moment he came to power, was what ultimately shaped the regime responsible for millions of deaths on battlefields, razed cities, and extermination camps. Hitler, after being crowned Fuhrer, the beginning of the Reich. On a personal level, Adolf Hitler always stood out for being a peculiar character, very different from the private display of other leaders of his time. His routine at the Chancellery usually began punctually around 10 in the morning, and he remained there until late at night reviewing documents and official matters. However, he was not rigid about his schedule, alternating his duties with speaking engagements. Impromptu public speaking engagements, whether delivering fiery speeches or overseeing unannounced military parades. When he had free time, he spent it doing activities that might have seemed unusual for a dictator. He enjoyed visiting museums, painting watercolors, attending film screenings, and immersing himself in reading. Among his favorite authors were Arthur Schopenhauer and Karl May. He also devoted hours to the study of history, with a particular predilection for classical Greece and the figure of Frederick II of Prussia. At the same time, he entertained himself by planning large-scale architectural projects, working alongside Albert Speer on the monumental redesign of Berlin, which he aspired to rename Germania. His musical interests played a prominent role in his private life. He was devoted to the work of Richard Wagner, to the point of establishing a personal relationship with Winifred Wagner, a descendant of the composer, and paying tribute by laying flowers at his grave. These cultural inclinations mingled with a cultivated image of a frustrated thinker and artist, which he sought to compensate for through the architecture and cultural symbolism of his regime. At his most intimate level, his personality was equally peculiar. He gave up alcohol, eventually adopted a vegetarian diet until he completely rejected meat, and displayed a marked aversion to decorating rooms with flowers. In contrast, he developed a great affinity with animals, especially his dogs, with his dog Blondie being his most beloved and faithful companion in the final years of his life. In private, Adolf Hitler was never a successful man romantically. His inability to relate to women, marked by extreme shyness and difficulty engaging in natural conversation, meant that his love life was plagued by silences and failures. The exception came with his niece Geli Raubal, daughter of his half-sister Angela. With her, Hitler broke down part of that barrier, albeit in an unhealthy way. The relationship became obsessive. He tried to win her over, but she rejected him time and again. The suffocating control and constant jealousy eventually pushed her to the limit. Finally, one day, Geli committed suicide with a gunshot to the chest. That tragedy plunged Hitler into a deep sadness that stayed with him for a long time. As the years passed, a new face appeared in his life: Eva Braun. Young, blonde, and employed in the photographic department of the Nazi Party, she quickly captivated the Fuhrer. It was to her that Hitler again felt a strong attachment, but he decided to keep this relationship a secret. For the German people, he wanted to project the image of a single leader, committed solely to Germany. This decision filled Eva with frustration and loneliness, and she lived in the background. Despite this, the two remained together until the very end, with the closure of the Berlin bunker. On a personal level, Hitler made his workplace in Berlin his home. The Chancellery was not only the center of political power, but also his residence, protected by more than 100 men from the SS Guard, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. However, his true refuge was high in the Bavarian Alps, in Obersalzberg, in the Berchtesgaden region. There he built a residence he named the Eagle's Nest for its privileged, elevated location. That alpine retreat became the most intimate setting of his private life. It was there that he shared family moments with Eva Braun and enjoyed his close surroundings away from the public eye. But that place also became the center of crucial decisions. From the Eagle's Nest, plans were drawn up that would shape not only the fate of the Third Reich, but also the course of world history. Adolf Hitler's administration of the Third Reich during the period between the two world wars was presented by his followers as an unprecedented achievement for a 20th century power. After taking over a devastated country, with a collapsed economy and millions of unemployed, the regime implemented an alternative model to the gold standard known as the work standard, with which it aggressively promoted internal recovery. Through a massive program of public works and productive reorganization, unemployment was drastically reduced, from approximately 8 million unemployed people to just over 3 million in a very short time, finally reaching full employment. With the disappearance of unemployment, the regime was able to announce significant improvements for the working and rural classes. A social assistance system based on small daily payments was established, healthcare coverage was expanded, labor protection was strengthened, and specific aid was created for families with children. Furthermore, services such as subsidized factory cafeterias, daycare centers, and childcare centers were promoted. One of the most notable aspects was the introduction of paid vacations, with excursions and organized trips to destinations such as Austria, Switzerland, Norway, and Bavaria, which reinforced the image of prosperity. Another symbol of this project was the production of an affordable car for the majority of the population, the famous Volkswagen, conceived as the people's car. The idea sought to reinforce the sense of collective well-being and showing that progress reached even the most modest households. These elements were used as visible proof of the supposed effectiveness of the National Socialist model compared to Western capitalism. Thanks to this set of measures, Germany regained a central role in global politics and economics in just a few years, once again projecting itself as a power. In official propaganda, the regime even presented itself as the pioneer of a welfare state, surpassing that of the United States, Great Britain, and France. This narrative contributed to Hitler being exalted by his followers in those years as the champion of the economy, a title that consolidated the triumphalist narrative of the Third Reich in its early days. Over the years, the Third Reich was transformed under Hitler's leadership, who promoted changes that affected virtually every sector. Industrial production intensified while agricultural harvests reached record levels in both quantity and quality, easily surpassing most European nations. However, one of the regime's most emblematic projects was the creation of the world's first large-scale highway network, which made it possible to speed up the transport of people and goods in reduced time. This was coupled with the strengthening of Lufthansa Airlines and the construction of dikes that reclaimed land from the sea, initiatives that further increased national wealth. Paradoxically, these monumental works coexisted with strict environmental protection laws. Animal experiments were banned, anti-tobacco campaigns were promoted, and programs were developed for reforestation, fertilization of swamps, channeling of rivers, and the creation of parks and green areas in cities. The accumulation of these transformations generated massive support for Hitler within Germany, as well as the admiration of numerous foreign sympathizers. For many citizens, the feeling was that of participating in a historic process that restored the pride lost after the Treaty of Versailles. The regime exploited this atmosphere through celebrations and public spectacles, labor competitions to extol the culture of work, art exhibitions, sports competitions, folk dances, youth camps, and above all the impressive party days in Nuremberg, which drew crowds to the Zeppelin field. The propaganda machine helped consolidate the idea that the German people were fulfilling a higher mission, a kind of providential destiny, as the Fuhrer himself constantly repeated. These mass events not only reinforced social cohesion, but also conveyed the impression that Germany was experiencing a collective renaissance that went beyond politics and economics, taking on an almost spiritual character. A key moment in this symbolic construction was the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Hitler assumed the role of absolute host, presenting a renewed image of his country to the world. From that event on, his image reached an international level that, in the eyes of numerous observers both inside and outside Germany, elevated him to the rank of a modern messiah, leader of a nation that felt called to lead a new era.